Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, and we're going to be discussing the Fear and Greed Index. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. If you're unfamiliar with the Fear and Greed Index, it comes from this page here. Link will be in the description below. Currently, we are at extreme greed in the 80s, although we do know we can stay in extreme greed for very long periods of time, just like we can stay in extreme fear for very long periods of time, as you can see back in 2022 and 2018. What makes up the Fear and Greed Index is a number of things, including volatility, market momentum, social media, surveys, Bitcoin dominance, and trends. So that's what makes it up. And that's what gives us a Fear and Greed Index value today of 80. Now, the last time I spoke about the Fear and Greed Index, I believe, was about a month ago. And considering that at this point the trend is still intact, I wanted to provide an update on it. One of the interesting things about the Fear and Greed Index is that, as we already pointed out, it can stay elevated for sometimes months before coming back down to earth. And other times, it will stay elevated for only a very brief period of time before coming back down to earth. Now, unfortunately, the Fear and Greed Index was only created in 2018, so we can't really see what it looked like back in 2016, 2017. We, of course, do have the risk metric that I talk about, part of ITC Premium, but that's different than the Fear and Greed Index. So we can see, though, that the Fear and Greed Index has been putting in higher lows for the most part, with the exception of, occasionally wicking below, but for the most part, higher lows and higher highs since June of 2022. So actually, when the price of Bitcoin went lower in late 2022, it actually corresponded to a higher low on the Fear and Greed Index. So maybe you could argue that was some form of divergence on the Fear and Greed Index with the price. And ever since then, it's been mostly putting in higher lows and higher highs, with the most recent high being in the 90s. Now, the reason we talked about that for so long was that we saw that, in fact, in 2019, also during high interest rates and quantitative tightening, which is where we are right now, we did, in fact, go into the 90s. In fact, we went up to 95. We unfortunately only spent a couple of days in that area before really coming back down to earth. However, in late 2020 and early 2021, we spent months at higher Fear and Greed Index levels. In fact, months in the 90s. And had you sold all of your Bitcoin when it, say, first hit 90 or so, you would have been selling it at 15K back in November of 2020. So you can see that sometimes it seems like it makes sense to get really cautious when it goes into the 90s, like 2019. Had you sold when it hit 95, you would have sold the top. Had you sold when it hit 95 over here in 2020, you might not have been as fortunate, right? Because we continue to go up for quite some time. So I do think it is relevant to also sort of factor in other variables as well. I don't really think the Fear and Greed Index in and of itself can be useful in terms of identifying like a strategy that will be useful to everyone. Because again, if all you ever do is sell anytime it hits 90, you would have been disappointed in late 2021 because the price of Bitcoin went up another 3x after that. Whereas in 2019, it would have timed the top. And this time, while it does seem like we are more similar to 2019 in terms of monetary policy, we have some similarities with other periods because, well, we are in fact at new all-time highs. So I don't really think it's as crystal clear as we'd all like it to be. I do think, as always, the cycles will continue to throw us curveballs, and we, of course, are seeing one right now. But at this point, if you look at the Fear and Greed Index, you can see it first had this base down here at around 5 to 10. Then it had a base around the 20s that it built off of, and then a base around the 50s or so. And then it formed this level, a higher low at around that same level. These were down here was really at the 40s and then at the 50s. and then all the way up here now, a higher low at the 70s. Now the question is will it actually take out the prior high on the fear and greed index? Because we actually already did go to 90. We speculated long ago that, based on all these past bull runs, right, the 2019 bull run, the 2021, the 2020, 2021 bull run, we did at least see the fear and greed index go into the 90s. And so we did see that already, right? And it corresponded almost to the high, right? It corresponded to, I guess, about 64K. And then we went up a little bit higher, all the way up to 73K. But still, the fear and greed index hit 88 around that prior high. So, again, it is elevated. We know it can stay elevated for a long period of time. I have to imagine that if we were to fast forward 6 months from now, we'll likely have seen it come back down, right? Because we don't often see it stay in the 90s for 6 months straight, right? There likely would be some form of a cool off phase, at some point within the next few months. But the question, I guess, to sort of consider here is will it get another move up into, for instance, the halving? Now, the halving is only a couple of weeks away. I don't really know if it's going to happen or not. I was looking at dominance is at 54%, by the way. I was looking at Bitcoin USD and kind of looking over here at what happened going into the spot ETF. And what you'll notice is that, about a week before the spot ETF, we swept the prior high, and then actually the launch of the spot ETF, we put in a higher high before then ultimately selling off and going below this low over here, right? So again, a lot of times once these patterns become noticeable, we switch to something else. So I'm not asking you to take it to the bank because we could very well switch to a new pattern. But if it were to follow something like that, it would mean sweeping the highs over here about a week before the halving. So potentially sometime this week, seeing it pull back or something maybe into the weekend, and then getting another push higher as the halving actually approaches, and then getting a larger dump after the halving. If it were to follow what happened over here going into the spot ETF, again, it could be different, right? This move could be very different, and it might not play out in the same way. But if it were to play out in the same way, right, which is a big if, but if it were, and we're already at a fear and greed index right now of 80, right? If we're already at 80, and if we were to see Bitcoin get a move, sweep the highs, come back down, and then go back up again, I would have to imagine there's at least a decent chance we would find ourselves with a fear and greed index back in the 90s, okay? So there's a decent chance that happens going into the halving, especially considering that all Bitcoin pairs have not broken down yet. I don't know why I have to work that into every video, but there it is. Until they break down, there's this idea that there's this liquidity, a pocket of liquidity that can make its way back over to Bitcoin. And so, does Bitcoin need to get that move in order to break the alt Bitcoin pairs down? I don't know, but we'll see if that happens going into the halving. So I would keep an eye on the higher low and higher high structure. Once that breaks, it could mean going into a different trend. Right now, if we were to take a look at let's say a 30-day moving average of this fear and greed index, you can see it's actually formed another higher high, right? So we had this low, a high, a higher low, and then a higher high. It's actually started to come down a little bit here. And in fact, if you look at 2019, the 30-day SMA of the fear and greed index actually topped out at a little lower than where it currently is, whereas the 30-day SMA in 2021 topped out, again, in the 90s because it stayed there for so long. Again, during QE and low interest rates, but also after new all-time highs were breached. Another interesting way to view the fear and greed index is to look at it color-coded. When you look at it like this, it can be interesting to isolate only the 90 to 100 areas, right? So you can see, and if you remove the price, right, there's three areas, right? 2019, 2020, and early 2021, and then what we saw back in early March of 2024, right? So it's not like it does warrant us to pay attention to it because it's not like it happens that frequently. It happened in 2019, it happened in late 2020 and early 2021, and this is the first time it's happened as we've hit the fear and greed index of the 90s really in about 3 years. So when it happens, it's worth paying attention to, which is why, I keep making videos on it about every month or so, because we hit the 90 level and we're still kind of hanging out in that zone. And if you look at the 80 to 100 level, you can see that, it still very much looks like things that we've seen before. I mean, a lot of times when you go into the 80 to 90s, you don't just spend a day there. You at least spend, a week or two, if not a couple of months in that zone before getting some type of larger pullback. Oftentimes, a pullback happens in the summer. In fact, this pullback over here, it topped in April. Coincidentally, around the third week of April is when we found a local top. And what's funny about that is that, again, the halving, I guess, is coming about the third week of April. Back over here in 2019, we actually rallied all the way until June, and then we finally had a pullback in July and August. So it was a bit later, well, really, I guess technically the summer starts June 21st. But still, I mean, later in the summer, the way most people would think about the summer, if it really didn't start to get that pullback until July. And even in July, it was almost sweeping the highs. But again, I do think it's worthwhile to sort of look at it like that. And then once you look at it like that, to then say, well, how long did it take to then go back to, say, 20, let's say 20 or less, right? So if you look at it like that, what do you notice, right? Once you go into the 80s or 90s, that extreme fear can actually come back really quickly, like just when no one expects it, right? Everyone gets super confident, and then when no one expects it, we're all of a sudden back in fear and greed, back below 20. And again, I mean, we've seen this play out over and over and over again, and it's like when the price goes up, it seems like we can't imagine it going down. When it goes down, we can't imagine it going up. And I don't really know exactly what the trigger is going to be, but as I've said before, I think the trigger for some type of switch to shifting back the other way would be whenever the altcoin market finally loses support, right? So whenever this breaks, I think that will be the trigger. I don't know when it's going to be. Could be April, could be May. I don't know. But I think that when that breaks, you could see it shift back sort of the other way, right? And again, normally when you go into these zones, 80 to 90 or 80 to 100, you can see those fearful times are usually not too far off, because that's what the market is, right? We go from extreme fear to extreme greed and back and forth, where we think that it can't go the other way, and then it does. And what's fascinating about over here is we went from extreme greed with a price of like 12.86K to extreme fear once it went back below 10K or around 10K. So all things considered, it wasn't really that big of a pullback. But the reason why back in 2019 it went from extreme fear, or from extreme greed to extreme fear, was because it was a first substantial pullback that we had for that entire bull run. Now, that bull run did not lead to new highs, right? But all those pullbacks were only like, 10%, 20% pullbacks, right? They were really small, really shallow pullbacks. So once you actually had a deeper pullback, right? In this case, once you actually had a larger drop of 30 to 40%, that's what brought that fear back in. But remember, that 30% drop did not actually happen until after all Bitcoin pairs broke down. That 30% drop did not happen until about 1 month before the first rate cut. These are all things we talk about on the channel, right? And again, I don't know when the first rate cut's going to be. It doesn't really look like it's going to be May at this point. So perhaps it will be June, right? Perhaps it will be June. June or July seems to be the most likely outcomes at the moment. But again, these are all things to consider. And the same thing, like we really have had very shallow pullbacks in this entire move, right? So what would it actually take to give you a larger pullback? I think what it would take would be seeing those alt Bitcoin pairs break below 0.4. So 0.39 is what I think you look for. Until then, party goes on, right? The fear and greed index continues to put in those higher lows and higher highs. When these break, I think you get a larger pullback just like 2019. Could very well be after the halving, right? I mean, this market has been very much narrative driven. We pile around the narratives as best we can, the spot ETF, the merge, the halving, whatever. You know, once those narratives are out of, once we're sort of beyond that, then you might see those alt Bitcoin pairs break down, and you could get a larger pullback, and that's where you could see the fear and greed index shift back the other way. But until then, I would keep an eye on it to see if it can get back into the 90 to 100 range. I mean, it still seems like it. I mean, at this point, it's still putting in a higher low, right? So until the trend breaks, it can be worthwhile to follow, as we said before. I mean, my whole strategy, as I've mentioned for the last like 2.5 years, has just been Bitcoin heavy crypto portfolio because I think dominance is going up. I don't know why I work that into every video, but again, fear and greed index is at 80. Here we go, color-coded version. This is the website that tracks it, and we'll see if over the next 10 to 11 days, if the fear and greed will go once again to the 90 to 100 zone. If it does, again, it could be a sort of a danger zone. The last time we hit 90 on the fear and greed index, not too long ago, we did get a little bit of a pullback there, right? But still in line with all of the prior pullbacks we've seen, and still a fairly shallow pullback at that. So again, I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up there. Thank you guys for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe, give the video a thumbs up. And again, I know I sort of say it in passing, subscribe, give the video a thumbs up, but I do really appreciate the people that have subscribed, and I do appreciate the thumbs up that you guys give the videos. They of course help the channel out, and we are very close to getting to 800,000 subscribers. So that would be a very nice milestone. So if you would do me a favor, give the video a thumbs up, subscribe, check out ITC Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. We still do have the sale going on. If you want to lock in those rates, make sure you do so before the halving, because prices will go up after the halving. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.